Hello and welcome to week 9 for plant biology. We are ticking right through the semester. Today we have a fair bit of material to cover, but I think it should be a big week but a manageable week for your reading assignment this week. So we're going to start out with chapters 7 and 8 in concepts of biology and then move over specifically into chapter 32 of Biology 2E. So again, it'll be 3 chapters worth of reading, but I'm not going to expect, let's say, mastery of the material, but more of a conceptual understanding of what's going on. So we can handle a little more material, I think, this week. Again, chapter 7 and 8 in concepts of biology, and then chapter 32 in Biology 2E. That chapter 32 is specifically about plant reproduction. 7 and 8 are more general discussions about reproductive strategies that we see in most eukaryotic cells. So we're going to start out talking with chapter 7 in concepts of biology, which is the cellular basis of inheritance. And so that's really talking about how sexual reproduction occurs in plants. And that's important because sexual reproduction really is about developing the genetic diversity that's required to be adaptable out in the environment in our ever-changing world. When we're talking about sexual reproduction, we're talking about the joining of two haploid gametes, and when we're talking about the words haploid and diploid, if an organism or a cell is haploid, it means it has a half of the usual complement of chromosomes. If it's diploid, it has the usual complement of chromosomes. So again, there's some terminology and jargon. Refer back to the glossary, refer back to previous readings, and refresh your memory if necessary. One of the specific and sort of different parts about plant reproduction is that they have a system of reproduction that's known as alternation of generations. And that's where they have both a haploid and a diploid life stage. In humans, what you're looking at here is my diploid life stage. What you are listening to on your computers is your diploid life stage. All of your body's cells have their full complement of chromosomes. With animals, most animals anyways, the reproductive cells, or the haploid cells, are usually only one cell. In the case of humans, it would be the sperm and the egg. Plants are different. Some plants have a haploid dominant life stage, and some plants have a diploid dominant life stage. And so they have this flipping of these sorts of which stage of the life the plant is in, depending on at what stage of the reproduction it is occurring. So pay some attention to alternation of generation. It's a strange sort of concept, but I think if you sit with it and work through it, it'll start to make sense. But understand that it is very, very different in many ways than human and other animal reproduction. So it's not going to follow sort of maybe your expected trajectory for what that reproductive event might look like. So alternation of generation can be definitely be a tricky concept, but work through it, and please, of course, feel free to ask me any questions that you may have. 7.2 talks about meiosis, which is about the production of gametes or sex cells, and these are the cells that are haploid or have these reduced numbers of chromosomes. And additionally, it's going to review steps of the cell cycle. You may have to go back and review those as well. 7.3 looks at errors of meiosis. So where can some major changes during the production of these reproductive cells occur? The book tends to focus more on humans because it's a general biology textbook rather than a specific plant biology book. But understand that the concepts are essentially the same, in that when you have these meiotic events, you can have these, I'll say, catastrophic sometimes changes in the chromosomal content of the gametes, and sometimes you'll have associated problems with the plant as it develops. So Chapter 7 is the cellular basis for inheritance. Again, it can be a bit daunting. I'm really looking for conceptual understanding rather than subject mastery on this one. Chapter 8 sort of is a continuation of Chapter 7. Not surprisingly, they are in sequence in the book. But Chapter 8 is looking at the patterns of inheritance that we see in organisms. And one of the great things about Chapter 8 is that the first and most famous project that looked at patterns of inheritance, so how do traits pass from one generation to the next? Why do our kids look like us? Why do we look like our parents? Those sorts of questions, those patterns of inheritance started in an organized way anyways with studies of plants. Gregor Mendel was a monk in the 1800s in what is now the Czechoslovakia, and he did an extensive amount of work looking at traits of pea plants specifically, and to gain an understanding of how these traits were passed from one generation to the next. So if you're looking at flower color, if you're looking at seed pod characteristics, if you're looking at seed characteristics, plant height, things like that are in these peas are very cleanly and precisely sort of conserved as these traits are moved through, and through extensive scientific experimentation, he was able to show that these traits are discretely passed from one generation to the other. This was a change in the thinking, and it really was provided a revolutionary sort of jolt to human understanding of how traits are moved from one generation to the next, rather than just a simple sort of mishmash blending. We do definitely see these traits that are moved very cleanly and explicitly from one generation to the next. Read through the discussion of Mendel's work, and please note how accurately it does sort of portray the movement of these inheritance patterns. And it's quite remarkable, especially given the period of time, again, in the mid-1800s that he was working. So the importance of Mendel's work and even current understanding of how genetics works really cannot be overstated. 8.2 moves in talking about our more sort of modern understandings about the laws of inheritance. We're going to see words like phenotype and genotype. Phenotype is the physical expression of the genotype. The genotype is the genetic information contained in an individual. We'll hear terms like homozygous and heterozygous, which is talking about what kind of condition the genotype is in for a trait. So just be aware of these terms and work at understanding what they mean. We're also going to be talking about dominance of traits, and so which of these genetic traits is dominant or expresses in the phenotype of an individual is an important thing to understand. And then they're also going to be looking at sort of predicted crosses. So if we have a plant with a trait that we're interested in and a plant that with a trait that we don't know, we can do some crosses and see and understand how these traits are moved forward in the genetics of the offspring, and we can gain some understanding about what those parent plants look like as well. It's also important to note that although we talk about dominance and recessive genes and things like that, there's definitely, most genes do not have this very explicit dominant or recessive sort of trait, and many of them are work along more of a smooth continuum rather than a strong binary. So we have concepts like incomplete dominance. We have traits that are located on multiple alleles. And some traits are sex-linked, so they may be only seen in one sex of the individual or another. So there's lots of variation. Again, go through Chapter 8. I'm looking, again, more for conceptual understanding rather than a strong specific knowledge of it. So read through it, understand it, and move forward. Chapter 32 in Biology 2E, the other textbook that we're using, is all about plant reproduction. It's a chapter dedicated specifically to the reproduction of plants. So we're going to talk about sexual reproduction in angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. They go through the different structures that make up flowers and seeds and things like that. Talking about development of male and female gametophytes, different structures, and then it moves into sexual reproduction of gymnosperms, which are things like pine trees. Again, looking at the different reproductive structures, the male and female gametophytes, how these things develop, and then comparing the difference between angiosperms and gymnosperms. Excuse me. So, looking at these reproductive structures very specifically and understanding that different types of plants have different types of reproductive structures. We're going to revisit the concept of alternation of generations in this section as well, so you'll get sort of a double dose of alternation of generations. The chapter moves on to talk about pollination and fertilization. Plants have very sometimes complex and sometimes very simple pollination schemes. Some pollination schemes require a very specific insect or other sort of animal that is required to come in and move pollen from one plant to another. Some plants simply spread their pollen out into the wind. Anybody who's ever parked their car under a pine tree while it's pollinating is very aware of the sort of broadcast pollination that pine trees can have. Your car can turn into a very sticky mess of pine pollen if necessary, if you leave it under a pollinating pine tree. Some plants, in fact, pollinate via water as well. So different pollination schemes for different plants are something you need to understand as well. This chapter moves further on to talk about not just pollination but fertilization, so how these gametophytes are actually coming together and forming a zygote and then developing into a seed. Some seeds germinate quickly, some require very elaborate almost schemes to break what's called dormancy to make sure that the conditions are right for these new seeds to germinate rather than hitting the ground and trying to grow right away. If we have plants outside here in Iowa at the end of October, that if they hit the ground and germinated right now, they'd grow up into little plants, and the first cold night where you have freezing temperature, they die immediately, and that would be the end of those plants. So some seeds have very specific criteria that they have to meet, a number of nights of freezing temperature, daylight time, things like that, that are required for these seeds to break their dormancy. Also, they talk about different strategies for seed dispersal. Seeds disperse in many different ways, and that's an interesting part of diversity to look at. After the sexual reproduction part, the chapter goes on to talk about asexual reproduction. Some plants have the capacity to reproduce asexually, so without any sort of so that's reproduction that does not involve the combination of gametes. You guys are definitely familiar with asexual reproduction in plants, although you may not know it. This is very different than animals. For the most part, most animals cannot reproduce asexually in these ways that plants can. We can't bury our arm or our leg underground and have a new human sprout up from it. Some plants can definitely grow a brand new tree by burying their limbs underground and having new roots set. So that can be very different than animals, but very interesting and commercially very relevant aspect of plant reproduction or plant propagation. And then the end of the chapter is looking at plant lifespans. So plants have different sorts of lifespans. So that should keep you guys busy for reading for this week. And if you have any questions, of course, please feel free to reach out. Have a great day and see you next week.